Let's begin by letting the body go heavy, one part at a time. There is nothing to do here except lie still and listen. Settle into whatever position you'll sleep in. Let the mattress take your weight. Take one slow breath in through the nose, and let it out through the mouth, unhurried. And another, longer on the way out than on the way in. Now let the breath go back to its own rhythm. You don't need to manage it. Bring your attention down to your feet, the soles, the tops, the spaces between the toes. Let them be completely soft. Nothing to hold, nothing to point anywhere. Let that softness move up through the ankles, into the calves. Your shins, your knees, heavy and warm and done for the day. The long muscles of the thighs, let them release into the bed. Your hips and your pelvis, sinking. Let the weight of your legs be carried entirely by whatever you're lying on. Now the belly. Let it be soft, and let it rise and fall without any help from you. The lower back. Every small muscle along the spine, letting go one at a time. Your chest, opening a little more with each breath out. Bring your attention out to your hands. The fingertips, the palms, the backs of the hands. Let the fingers curl slightly, whatever way they want to fall. Up through the wrists, the forearms, the elbows, heavy. Your upper arms, and then your shoulders. See if the shoulders can drop even a little further away from your ears. The neck, let the head be fully supported, so the neck has nothing left to carry. Now the jaw, let the teeth part slightly. Let the tongue rest low in the mouth. The cheeks and the small muscles around the mouth, going slack. Let the eyes be heavy behind their lids. No need to look at anything, even in the dark. Smooth the forehead. Let the space between the eyebrows widen. And let it spread back over the scalp, all the way to the back of the head. Now take in the whole body at once. Heavy, warm, and quiet, from the scalp to the soles of the feet. If anywhere still feels tight, breathe out into it and let it be tight. It will loosen on its own. There's nothing left for you to do tonight. In a moment, a story is going to start. It's a true one, about water underneath a desert, and about people who dug for it 1,500 years ago. You don't need to follow it. You don't need to remember any of it. Let the words come and go, the way water moves under sand, and let yourself drift off whenever you're ready. The walls built to leak. A sleep essay on the puquios of Nazca. About 3 kilometers east of the town of Nazca, on the southern coast of Peru, there is a field with holes in it. They are not the kind of holes you would trip into. They are enormous, shallow, and beautiful, shaped like inverted cones, like the funnels of vast phonographs pressed into the earth. Some of them are 15 meters across at the surface and narrow to a meter or two at the bottom. And their sides are lined with river stones set in a spiral, so that a person can walk down the inside of the cone in a slow curve, turning as they descend, until they are standing several meters below the level of the surrounding desert, in a cool place, next to running water. The site is called Cantalak. The holes are called ojos, eyes, and each one is an opening onto a tunnel. If you crouch at the bottom and look sideways, you can see the tunnel going off in 2 directions, upstream and downstream, dark and low, lined with cobbles, carrying a thin, steady stream of water that came from nowhere visible and is going somewhere you cannot see. The water is clear. It has been filtered through several kilometers of gravel. In the middle of one of the driest landscapes on the planet, the water is simply there, and it has been simply there, more or less continuously, for something on the order of 1,400 years. There are around 3 dozen of these systems still working in the valleys around Nazca. They are called puquios, from the Quechua word puquiu, meaning a spring or a source, and the flat truth about them is stranger than the mystery that gets attached to them in guidebooks. The mystery, as usually told, is, how did ancient people build such sophisticated aqueducts? But they are not aqueducts, not really, and the interesting question is not how they were built. The interesting question is how anyone figured out, from a few holes in a desert and some potsherds lying on a low ridge of dugout gravel, when they were built and by whom. That turned out to take most of a century, and it produced one of the more elegant arguments in the archaeology of the Americas, an argument won not by chemistry or by satellites, but by broken pottery lying exactly where you would expect broken pottery to lie. To understand any of it, you have to start with the water, and with the peculiar way that water behaves on the south coast of Peru. The coastal strip of Peru is a desert because of the ocean. The cold Humboldt Current runs north along the shore, chilling the air above it, and cold air holds very little moisture and does not rise, so it does not rain. Fog rolls in. Rain essentially does not fall. Some weather stations along that coast have gone years between measurable precipitation events. And yet a series of rivers cross that desert, running from the Andes down to the sea, because high up in the mountains, far inland, it does rain, seasonally and hard. So the rivers of the Nazca region are strange rivers. In the wet months, roughly December through March, they run, sometimes violently. For the rest of the year, most of them do not run at all, or rather, they run underground. The valleys are floored with deep beds of alluvium, gravel and sand and cobbles washed down from the mountains over hundreds of thousands of years. And when the surface flow dwindles, the water does not vanish. It sinks into the gravel and keeps going, moving down valley through the pore spaces between the stones, invisibly, at the pace of a slow walk in a day, following the same gradient the river followed. You can be standing in a dry riverbed in the Nazca Valley in September, in dust, with the wind picking up grit off the stones, and there will be water moving 3 meters below your feet. This is the fact the whole story rests on. The Rio Grande de Nazca drainage is not a dry place with occasional water. It is a wet place with a lid on it. The 3 valleys that matter here are Nazca, Tarruga, and Las Trancas, 3 of the southern tributaries of the Rio Grande system, and they share an awkward geometry. In their upper reaches, near the mountains, there is surface water for much of the year. In their lower reaches, near the coast, the water table comes close enough to the surface that shallow wells work and springs emerge naturally. But in the middle, in the stretch of valley where the land is flattest and widest and would make the best farmland, the water sits too deep for a hand-dug well and too shallow to have any business being called deep. The middle valley, agriculturally speaking, is a tease. Good soil, good sun, no water, and water 20 feet under it. Somebody looked at that problem and solved it, and the solution is the puquio. The idea is this. If the water is moving through the gravel down valley at a slight downhill gradient, and if you dig a tunnel that also runs down valley, but at a slightly gentler gradient than the water table, then at the upstream end, your tunnel will be below the water table, and at the downstream end, it will be above it. Water will seep into the tunnel through its upper reaches, collect in the floor, run along it, and eventually the tunnel will emerge from the hillside or the valley wall at the surface, delivering water at ground level, where you can put it in a canal and irrigate with it. You have not lifted the water. You have not pumped it. You have simply given it a slightly easier path than the one it was taking, and let gravity do everything. Engineers call this a filtration gallery. It is worth pausing on the difference between a filtration gallery and an aqueduct, because it is the difference between 2 entirely opposite philosophies of building. An aqueduct is a vessel. Its whole purpose is to be watertight. A Roman aqueduct is lined with hydraulic mortar, precisely so that no water is lost through the walls. Every drop that enters at the spring should arrive at the city. The engineering problem is containment, and the enemy is leakage. A filtration gallery is the opposite. It is designed to leak inward. The walls of a Nazca puquio gallery are built of smooth, rounded river cobbles laid up dry, without mortar of any kind, and that is not a limitation of the available technology. It is the functional heart of the design. The gaps between the stones are the intake. Groundwater enters through the wall along the entire upstream length of the tunnel, seeping in from every direction, and the loose cobble facing does 2 jobs at once. It holds back the surrounding gravel so the tunnel does not collapse, and it strains the water as it passes, so that what arrives in the channel is filtered clean. A puquio is not a pipe. It is a very long, very narrow, walkable drain, and it works because it is porous. The proportions of the thing are worth dwelling on, because they are humble in a way that gets lost when these systems are called marvels. The underground galleries are typically between 50 and 80 centimeters wide, and up to about 1.5 meters high. Many are less than 1 meter square in cross-section. That is not a passage. That is a crawl. A person maintaining a puquio does so bent double or on hands and knees, in the dark, in water, under several meters of gravel that is held off their head by dry-laid stones and a roof of either dressed stone slabs or wooden beams. The gallery lengths vary enormously, from a few meters up to about 372 meters for the longest documented example. Along their course, at intervals of roughly 10 to 30 meters, the ojos open to the sky. The ojos are the part everybody photographs, and they exist for the most prosaic reason imaginable. Somebody has to get in there. They are access hatches. They also ventilate the tunnel, so that a person working in it can breathe, and they let people draw water directly for household use without walking to the outlet. At the surface, they can be up to 15 meters wide, funneling down to the tunnel mouth. The famous spiral stone ramps at Cantilock, the ones that make the site look like a piece of land art, are partly a modern reconstruction, and honest scholarship on the subject is careful to say so. We do not actually know how elaborate the original ojos were, and the beautiful corkscrew may be a 20th century tidying up of something rougher. Where a gallery emerges at the surface, it usually continues as an open trench, called a zanja. These are cut in a wide, shallow V, terraced and faced with cobbles, about 1 meter across at the base and widening to as much as 10 meters across at the top, and some of them run for more than 1 kilometer. Eventually the trench delivers its water into a small reservoir, a kacha, which acts as a holding tank and a distribution point, and from the kacha, the water is let out into ordinary surface irrigation canals, acequias, and onto the fields. Zanja, Galeria, Ojo Kacha. Trench, gallery, reservoir. That is the entire vocabulary of the system, and the whole thing runs on a gradient that has been measured at an average of about 1.4%, which is to say a drop of about 1.5 meters for every 100 meters of length. That number is the real achievement. Too steep and the water runs fast, scours the channel, undercuts the walls, and the tunnel collapses. Too shallow and the water stalls, silts up and stops. Somebody had to establish and hold a gradient of 1.5% through hundreds of meters of tunnel that they were digging blind, underground, in gravel, without being able to see either end at once. There is no evidence of any surveying instrument. There is only the result, which works. Today 36 puquios still function, 29 in the Nazca Valley, 2 in Taruga, and 5 in Las Trancas. Historical records and abandoned traces suggest that perhaps 50 once existed. Each has a name, usually the name of the land it waters. Achaco, Aje Alto, Pangavari, or Kona, Cantilock. They are not monuments. They are named the way fields are named. So, who dug them? For most of the 20th century, the answer was assumed rather than argued. The systems were obviously old, they were obviously indigenous in style, and they were in Nazca, so they were Nazca. A Peruvian priest named Alberto Rosell Castro surveyed and wrote about them in the 1940s and took them to be pre-Inca. The engineer Alberto Regal, writing on Inca hydraulic works, credited them to the Inca state. Neither position rested on much more than plausibility. And plausibility, in archaeology, is where trouble starts. In 1991, 2 scholars, Monica Barnes and David Fleming, published a paper in the journal Latin American Antiquity called Filtration Gallery Irrigation in the Spanish New World. And it detonated the comfortable assumption. Their argument was not that the Nazca people were incapable of such a thing. It was much better than that. It was an argument from the history of technology, and it went roughly as follows. Filtration galleries are a very old world technology. In Iran, they are called qanats, and they are ancient, plausibly first millennium BCE, and they spread west across the Islamic world with astonishing thoroughness. Into Iraq, Arabia, North Africa, and eventually into Spain, where Muslim Andalusia used them for centuries, and where their Arabic-derived vocabulary survives in Spanish. Spain, in other words, arrived in the Americas with filtration gallery technology in its hands, along with a mining tradition that made constant use of horizontal drainage adits, which are structurally the same thing pointed at a different purpose. And Spanish colonists demonstrably did build filtration galleries in the New World. Barnes and Fleming documented them, including systems in western Mexico dating to the 1520s, within a few years of the conquest. Then they added the argument from silence. If the puquios of Nazca were already there, working, when the Spanish arrived, why does no early Spanish chronicler exclaim about them? The Spanish wrote about everything. They wrote about Inca roads, Inca storehouses, Inca masonry, with the mixture of contempt and awe that colonizers reserve for infrastructure they could not have built themselves. A field full of enormous spiral holes feeding underground rivers is exactly the sort of thing that gets written down. And it is not written down, not in the early accounts. So perhaps it was not there. It was a strong case. It had a mechanism, a documented parallel, a plausible transmission route, and a suggestive absence. For a while, it looked as though the puquios might have to be reclassified as one of the more impressive works of the Spanish colonial period, and the Nazca stripped of their most famous piece of engineering that wasn't a drawing. The rebuttal came in 1995 from Katharina Schreiber and Josue Lancho Rojas in the same journal in a paper simply called The Puquios of Nazca. Schreiber was an archaeologist who had spent years doing systematic settlement survey in those valleys. Lancho Rojas was a local scholar from Nazca who had spent a lifetime with the puquios themselves, walking them, measuring them, knowing which ones were cleaned in which month and by whom. The combination mattered, the outside specialist and the person who actually lived there. Between them, they took the colonial hypothesis apart in 3 moves. The first move was to check the chroniclers. Barnes and Fleming had built part of their case on the silence of early Spanish writers about the puquios, and Schreiber and Lancho went and looked at which writers, exactly, were being asked to be silent. Of the 5 colonial sources at issue, 4 had never been to the Nazca Valley at all. Their silence about a local irrigation system in a minor valley they never visited is not evidence of anything. The one writer who did describe the puquios was Reginaldo de Lizarraga, whose account dates to about 1605, and this is where the argument from silence turns around and works the other way. Lizarraga describes the systems. He does not attribute them to the Inca, and, crucially, he does not attribute them to Spaniards either. A Spanish friar in 1605, describing a remarkable irrigation work built by Spanish colonists within living memory, in a colony obsessed with recording Spanish achievement, would say so. He says nothing of the kind. He describes them as simply present, as a feature of the place. The second move was chronometric, and it was contributed by 2 other researchers, Persis Clarkson and Ronald Dorn, in a companion paper in the same year. Puquios are almost impossible to date directly, for a maddening reason. They are made of the landscape. A puquio is river cobbles from the riverbed, laid in a hole in the gravel, roofed with slabs from the same ground. There is nothing to carbon date, because nothing about it was ever alive and nothing about it was manufactured. Clarkson and Dorn found a way around this by dating not the stones but what had grown on them. In deserts, exposed rock surfaces slowly accumulate a dark coating called rock varnish, a microscopically thin layer of clay and manganese and iron oxides laid down over centuries, and trapped within that varnish are tiny quantities of organic material, which can be dated by accelerator mass spectrometry. If you can date the varnish that formed on the upper face of a stone lintel, you have a minimum age for when that lintel was put in place. They sampled lintels at the Orcona and Cantiloc puquios and got two results. Calibrated to about the years 560 to 650, and about 600 to 660. Taken together, somewhere in the range of the mid-6th to mid-7th century of the Common Era. 900 years before any Spaniard set foot in the valley. The third move is the one I find beautiful, because it uses no instruments at all. It is the argument from rubbish. Consider what happens when you dig a trench a kilometer long through desert gravel with hand tools. You have to put the gravel somewhere. What you get alongside the trench is a berm, a low, long ridge of excavated material running parallel to the cut. That berm is a new surface. It did not exist before the trench was dug, and everything found lying on it must have arrived after. Berms are also, being slightly raised and dry and out of the way, convenient places to walk, to sit, to eat lunch, to stand while you argue about water rights. In other words, they collect debris. So Schreiber and Lancho and their survey teams walked the berms and collected what was on them. And what was on them was pottery. Sherds datable to Nazca Phase 5 and to the phases after it, and on through the Middle Horizon and the Late Intermediate period. In other words, people were dropping pottery on those spoil heaps from roughly the 6th century onward, continuously, for 1,000 years before the Spanish arrived. If Spanish colonists had dug those trenches in the 1500s, the berms would be 16th century surfaces and could not possibly carry 1,000 years of pre-Hispanic ceramics. The pottery is not on the puquio. It is on the pile of dirt that could only exist if the puquio was already dug. The dating is inescapable, and it comes from garbage. And then, having established when, the settlement survey established something even better. What changed? Schreiber's systematic survey of these valleys had mapped where people actually lived, phase by phase. In the earlier Nazca phases, habitation clusters sit in the lower valley and the upper valley, in the two zones where water is naturally accessible. And the middle tributaries, the ones with the good flat land and the inconveniently deep water table, are essentially empty. Nobody lived there because nobody could. Then, from around Nazca Phase 5, settlements appear in exactly those middle stretches. People move into land that had been uninhabitable, and they do it precisely where the puquios deliver water. That is not a correlation you can explain away. A colonial-era irrigation system cannot cause a 6th century population to move into a valley. The puquios are dated not just by the varnish on their lintels and the sherds on their berms, but by the shape of an entire society rearranging itself around them. There is a final detail that turns the chronology from a date into a story. Paleoclimate records for the region, from ice cores and other proxies, indicate significant droughts on the south coast in roughly the years 540 to 560, and again from about 570 to 610. That is exactly the window. The puquios were not built in a moment of confident prosperity, as a flourish. They appear to have been dug during a prolonged failure of the ordinary water supply, by people who were watching their rivers stop running earlier each year and who went looking for the water in the only place left, which was underneath them. The technology is a response to a drought. It is what desperation looks like when it is competent. Which brings us back to the Khanats of Iran, and to a question that turns out to be more interesting than the one Barnes and Fleming were asking. If the puquios are pre-Hispanic and the Khanats are Iranian, then here are two societies, separated by half the planet and by any possibility of contact, that independently arrived at the same answer. A nearly level tunnel driven into an alluvial fan to intercept groundwater, with vertical shafts at intervals for access and ventilation, terminating in an open channel and a distribution basin. Not merely a similar idea. The same machine, down to the shafts. The temptation is to call this a coincidence, or to reach again for some hidden transmission. It is neither. It is what happens when two groups of people are handed an identical problem by geology. Arid basin, mountains upslope, deep permeable alluvium, water moving invisibly through gravel toward the sea, and good soil sitting on top of it. Given that setup, the space of workable solutions is not large. You cannot lift the water without pumps you do not have. You cannot store rain that does not fall. You cannot line a channel you have no mortar for. What is left is to go and meet the water where it already is, and to bring it out along a gentler slope than the one it is on. Iran found it. Nazca found it. The oases around Turpan, in western China, found it too, and there is a long argument about whether those karez are local invention or borrowed from Persia, which tells you something about how naturally the design recurs. It is a useful correction to the way we usually think about ancient technology. We tend to imagine invention as a spark, a singular genius, a thing that happens once and then diffuses. Sometimes it is that. But sometimes a technology is less an invention than a discovery, in the way a mathematical theorem is a discovery. The landscape contains the solution, and any sufficiently attentive people, given enough generations in that landscape, will find it. The puquio was sitting in the gravel of the Nazca Valley, waiting for someone to notice it. For a long time after Schreber and Lancho, the chronology was settled, and the attention moved on. What reopened the subject was not a shovel, but a satellite. Beginning in the 2000s, a group of Italian researchers at the Institute of Methodologies for Environmental Analysis, part of Italy's National Research Council, led by Rosa Lassapanara and Nicola Massini, began working on the Nazca region with remote sensing. Their problem was the one Clarkson and Dorn had run into from a different angle. The puquios are made of the landscape, so they are nearly invisible to the usual detection methods. But they are not invisible to water. The technique is indirect and rather lovely. A working puquio, or even a long-abandoned one, alters the moisture content of the ground along its course, and moisture shows up in the infrared. So the team pulled decades of satellite imagery, going back to Landsat scenes from the 1970s and forward through Landsat and Aster imagery from the 1990s and 2000s, and computed indices from it. The Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which measures how much living plant matter is present, and the Normalized Difference Water Index, which is sensitive to moisture, along with a transformation called the tasseled cap, which reweights the spectral bands to separate soil brightness from greenness from wetness. On the resulting images, the desert stops being uniform. Faint lines and patches appear where the ground is measurably damper, or where a few more plants are managing to grow. And some of those lines are puquios, including some that no longer carry water and had not been recognized. More than finding individual features, though, the satellite work did something the ground survey could not easily do, which was to see the whole thing at once. Mapped from above, across the drainage, the puquios stop looking like 36 separate local solutions and start looking like a single distributed response to a mapped hydrology. The imagery let the team classify the tributaries by their water behavior. The ones that flow perennially, the ones that flow seasonally or in some years and not others, and the ones where the flow is essentially always underground and the water table rises and falls out of sight. And the puquios sit, unsurprisingly and yet satisfyingly, exactly where that third category dominates. Somebody had built a mental model of the invisible water of an entire drainage basin, tributary by tributary, and then dug accordingly. And 1,500 years later, a spectral index from orbit reproduces their map. The same body of work is the source of the claim that most often gets attached to the puquios in popular accounts, which is that the ojos functioned as wind-driven pumps. The suggestion is that the funnel and spiral geometry of the shafts catches the desert wind, drives air down into the tunnel system, and that the resulting pressure differential helps push water through the galleries, so that the holes are not merely hatches, but part of the hydraulic machinery. It is a genuinely interesting idea, and I want to be careful with it, because it is repeated far more confidently than the evidence supports. The proposal rests on morphology and on spatial reasoning, not on measurement. Nobody has instrumented a puquio, recorded wind speeds at the ojos and pressures in the gallery, and demonstrated a flow contribution. And it runs into the awkward fact mentioned earlier, which is that the elaborate spiral shafts at Cantilock are substantially reconstructed. So the geometry doing the work in the hypothesis may not be ancient geometry. It is entirely possible that the wind does something. It is also entirely possible that the ojos are exactly what they appear to be, which is doorways, and that the water moves for the boring reason that it is running downhill. The hypothesis deserves to be tested rather than either repeated or dismissed, and it is a nice illustration of how a striking mechanism, once it gets into circulation, hardens into fact by repetition long before anyone has actually checked. Because the real mechanism, the one that has actually kept these systems running for 14 centuries, is not aerodynamic. It is social. A puquio silts up. Water carrying fine sediment through a gravel-walled tunnel deposits some of that sediment continuously, and left alone, a gallery chokes itself within a few years. Roots find their way in. A roof beam of Huarango wood rots, and a section of ceiling comes down. The cobble facing shifts, and a length of wall slumps inward. None of this is dramatic. All of it is fatal on a timescale of a decade or two, which means that every functioning puquio in the Nazca Valley today represents an unbroken chain of maintenance stretching back to the 6th century. An annual event in which people climb down through the ojos, crawl along a tunnel 50 to 80 centimeters wide, in the dark, in water, and shovel silt out by hand, passing it up the shafts, section by section, along hundreds of meters, and then replace the beams that need replacing and rebuild the walls that have moved. That work has to be organized. It requires deciding who goes down, and when, and who feeds them, and how the resulting water is divided among the fields it reaches, and what happens when someone takes more than their share, and who inherits the obligation when an old man who knows which section always collapses first finally dies. The engineering knowledge of a puquio is not principally in its stones. It is distributed across a community as a body of practice. An oral map of the tunnel, a calendar, a set of rights and duties, and a set of hands that know what damp gravel feels like when it is about to give. This is what makes the puquio a different kind of artifact from an aqueduct or a pyramid. A Roman aqueduct, once built, works whether or not anyone understands it, until it eventually fails, and then it is simply gone. A puquio cannot coast. It only exists in the present tense. Every year it is either maintained or it begins to die, which means that the survival of a puquio is direct evidence of the survival of a form of social organization. Continuously, across the Nazca collapse, the Wari expansion, the Inca conquest, the Spanish conquest, the colonial period, independence, and the 20th century. When we say that 36 puquios still function, we are not describing the durability of dry stone masonry. We are describing the durability of an agreement. Agreements can end, though, and this one nearly did once already. The Nazca culture, the one that dug the puquios and drew the lines and painted the extraordinary polychrome pottery, declines and disappears in the centuries after the puquios were built. There is a body of work, most fully developed by the archaeobotanist David Beresford Jones in a study of the lower Ica Valley just to the north, that argues the collapse was in an important sense self-inflicted, and that the mechanism was a tree. The tree is the Huarango, Prosopis pallida and its relatives, a mesquite of extraordinary usefulness. It grows in desert floodplains, sends roots down enormous distances to the water table, fixes nitrogen, produces edible pods and dense fuel wood and building timber, and its canopy shades and its roots bind. Beresford Jones's argument, drawing on excavated plant remains and sediment sequences, is that over centuries the Huarango woodlands of these valleys were progressively cleared for fuel, for construction, and above all to open ground for agriculture, and that the woodland was doing structural work that nobody had accounted for. Its roots held the floodplain together, its litter maintained the soil, its canopy moderated the surface. Remove it, and the valley floor becomes a loose surface of dry sediment held in place by nothing. Then comes an El Niño year, and instead of a flood the valley absorbs, there is a flood that scours. The floodplain strips. Fields become gravel. The water table drops as the sediment structure changes, and an agricultural system that had been finely tuned to a specific hydrology finds that the hydrology has been rearranged, and the trees that would have to grow back in order to stabilize it take a very long time to grow, and cannot grow at all if the surface they need has been carried away. There is an irony in this that is almost too neat, so I will note it once and let it go. Puquio roofs were framed with Huarango beams. The system that made the Middle Valley habitable was partly built out of the tree, whose removal helped make it uninhabitable again. That is not an argument about causation, just a fact about a landscape in which everything was made of the same few things. What happened after is the interesting part. The Nazca culture ends. The puquios do not. They pass into other hands, get cleaned by other people, water other crops for other polities, and simply continue, which is a good reminder that the collapse of a civilization and the collapse of its infrastructure are separate events that we habitually confuse. The threat now is different, and it is stranger than flood or conquest because it is prosperity. The coastal valleys of Peru have become, over the last few decades, an agricultural export zone of considerable scale, growing asparagus and grapes and citrus for markets in the Northern Hemisphere. That kind of farming does not run on 36 community-maintained filtration galleries. It runs on diesel or electric pumps and deep boreholes that go straight down into the aquifer and lift as much water as the pump can lift. The boreholes are faster, they are not seasonal, and they do not require anybody to crawl anywhere. They also draw the water table down, which quietly starves the puquios from below, since a gallery that was dug to sit just under the water table stops receiving water when the water table falls beneath its floor. And the second-order effect is worse than the first. When a puquio stops being economically necessary, the annual cleaning stops being worth the trouble. When the cleaning stops, the people who know how to do it get older and are not replaced, because the knowledge is not written down anywhere and cannot be, since it is knowledge of a particular tunnel. And when those people are gone, the puquio is not merely disused. It is unrecoverable, in the sense that even if you wanted it back, you would be starting from a survey rather than from a practice. A silted gallery can be cleaned. A forgotten one cannot be remembered. Which is the situation in the Nazca valleys now, in a mild and unspectacular way. A small number of systems still working, a smaller number of specialists who maintain them, some interest from heritage and tourism, and a groundwater regime being shaped by decisions made for reasons that have nothing to do with them. And underneath that, the awareness that the aquifer is finite, that the pumps are drawing it down, and that at some point the region will face exactly the problem the 6th century faced, which is a shortage of water in a valley that has water in it, just not where anybody can reach it. The puquios are the region's own answer to that question, written 1400 years ago in the local dialect, still legible, still running, quietly demonstrating a way of getting water out of a desert that costs no fuel and lasts indefinitely, provided somebody shows up in the spring with a shovel. I keep coming back to the potsherds on the berms. There is something clarifying about the fact that the strongest evidence for the age of these systems was not a laboratory result, but litter. The rock varnish dating is elegant, and the satellite indices are elegant, and both of them are the sort of thing that makes headlines, and neither of them is what actually settled the question. What settled it was somebody walking along a low ridge of excavated gravel, picking up broken pottery, and recognizing what the ridge had to be. The argument works because a berm is a consequence. It could not exist unless somebody had dug, and so anything lying on it has to post-date the digging. And if what is lying on it is 1,000 years of pre-Hispanic ceramics, then the digging is pre-Hispanic, and there is nothing more to discuss. Archaeology is full of that shape of reasoning, and it is a genuinely different way of knowing things than the one we usually reach for. We are trained to interrogate the object, date this, analyze that, put the sample in the machine. But the puquios resisted that entirely. They had no organic material, no manufactured components, no stylistic decoration, no inscription. They were anonymous by construction, made of nothing but the ground rearranged. And so they had to be dated by their consequences instead. By the dirt they displaced, by the surfaces that dirt created, by the rubbish that accumulated on those surfaces, and by the villages that appeared in a valley that had been empty because someone had made it possible to live there. There is a version of that thought that I find restful rather than melancholy, and it is where I want to leave this. The puquios are not remarkable because they are old. Plenty of things are old. They are remarkable because they are the rare kind of technology whose working parts include a society, and which therefore cannot be found abandoned and functional the way a stone bridge can. Every one of the 36 that still runs is running because of an unbroken sequence of ordinary decisions made every year for something like 1,400 years, by people who mostly did not know or care what century they were maintaining a tradition from. They just knew that the tunnel needed cleaning before the dry season, and that if it were not cleaned, there would be no water in a Chaco or Aja Alto or Pangavari, and so they cleaned it. The walls were built to leak. The knowledge was built to be reused, and the whole thing has outlasted every empire that ever governed it, on the strength of nothing more durable than the habit of showing up. Somewhere out there tonight, 3 kilometers east of a small town in the Peruvian desert, water that fell as rain in the Andes some months ago is moving through the dark, through the gaps between river cobbles that somebody stacked by hand around the year 600, running downhill at 1.5% on its way to a field.